Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Pow, and today I am here with my husband, Sush.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about our rankings for the Hugo Award Novelette finalists. The Hugo Awards are awards given out by Worldcon for SFF works. So these are all novelettes, which is in between short story and novella length. We do have a video with our rankings for short stories, so I will link that below, and we'll be doing novellas and novels later on as well. So for this video, we're going to be talking just a brief description about what each of the novelettes is, and then really our thoughts on it, as well as our rankings. And we're going to be going in my ranking. Sush and I have slight differences, but we often have very similar feelings and very similar rankings. So now let's get into the novelettes. We're going to start at the bottom ranked and work our way up to top ranked. The first two stories that we're going to talk about are actually unranked for me. And the way that voting for the Hugos works, they use ranked choice, which means that you don't have to rate everything, but anything that you rank, if your top rating books get eliminated, then they will count your votes for the next and the next in your rating list until everything is eliminated. So if you don't want something to get an award, you can just leave it unranked. So the first two that we're going to talk about are unranked for me because I DNF'd them, but Sush read them, so he's going to talk about them.
Well, as it turns out, they're the bottom of my ranking, so I don't know that that's that much different apart from the no vote category. But right at the bottom then is Monster by Naomi Kritzer. And this is a story which is a simple story of a woman going in search of one of her childhood friends. And then the story kind of develops from there. The word monster for me kind of set up expectations in a sense, at least from the way the story was leading, that this might be, discussions on who is the monster between, say, Frankenstein's monster and Frankenstein, and things like that. But it did not go down there. It kind of, I think the main thing here is that you are seeing this from the category or trope of a geeky misfit as a kid, and now they're grown up and their lives have taken different paths. And so there is some amount of things over there that I think a lot of geeks can connect to. On the other hand, I also find that frequently a lot of geek pride can instead wind up being poking fun with normies, so to speak. And that really gets, annoys me in a sense. And I think this story did a fair amount of that. It didn't really work for me in terms of characters or world building. There is a plot and there is a kind of like a story to follow along with, but overall I would say this story didn't really do anything for me.
Yeah, and I just was so unengaged. I was judging it. I kept getting annoyed by things in it, and that idea of kind of, I don't know, talking about geek culture and really having a character who is so geeky, not like other girls, it was just rough for me. In our short story discussion, we read another short story by Naomi Kritzer, which also had this sort of book elitism in it that I found in this story too. And both of them, they just very much kind of got to me. For example, there is a bit where the main character is called a monster because she dog ears her books. And it's just like, just little bits of book elitism that just didn't work for me. And I wasn't engaged in the story. And it just, yeah, I just didn't care enough to keep reading.
Next up, we have The Inaccessibility of Heaven by Aliette de Bodard. So this story actually from an environment perspective is really neat. You have essentially fallen angels in a human-ish world, along with witches and things like that, and cars and skyscrapers and guns and drug cartels and things like that. And one of the things that is also done in this is this notion of angels' bones being one of the sources of a very popular drug. And also the fact that a lot of the angels essentially find their being cut off from heaven on a permanent basis as something which has varying degrees of psychological effect on different kinds of angels. And so in this kind of a world, we now have a murder mystery of sorts. So actually the setup and the environment, I think, is really neat. The world building definitely has a lot of character to it. You definitely feel the environment, and it's definitely leading down a dystopian side of things. So the thing that I will mention for this, though, is that from a theming perspective, I think the main things I can say that I noticed are that it kind of looks at when you put someone on a pedestal and they basically have a fall from it, or the notion of a redemption story of a person that you don't like, are basically all the same type of story of how you see other people. It's not about them, it's about you, in a sense. And that's the main theming that I got from this, and there is a fairly compelling story that is being told over here. Having said that, the story arc, the type of story that this was, is not the type of story that I'm particularly interested in. And so it was a story that I read, is basically what I wound up feeling about it in comparison to some of the other stories here.
And I think that's kind of what happened with me too. I DNF'd this pretty early on. It's very much an urban fantasy, so a murder mystery, but very much like along the lines of more of a police procedural type of mystery, and it's got this gritty feel, and I just don't like stories that are quite that grim. I do like a lot of other things that Aliette de Bodard has written, so I know I like her as an author, but just this story, I was kind of put off by that crime feeling to it, as well as just the sort of gruesome dead bodies that it started with. I was like, I don't know. I'm very squeamish, and so I was just like, I just don't think that this is going to be the story for me. But that, I think, for both of us is more of an issue of just urban fantasy not being so much what we like to read, rather than any real problem with de Bodard's writing. Now moving on to stories that are actually ranked, beginning with number 4, Helicopter Story by Isabel Fall. So this is a story that takes place in a dystopian type of world where war is very constant, and the US government has decided to do some operations so that they can have people transition genders into attack helicopter genders, so that they have almost this second nature of war and fighting, and it's just innate for the people who transition into this gender to kind of do the things that helicopters do. And so we follow a woman who has transitioned into attack helicopter gender, and just the way that she's reflecting on that transition and the way that she kind of has internalized all of these aspects of being an attack helicopter, and it's really a reflection on gender and the internalization of a lot of that. So this story is very interesting because of the history of it. So it's kind of controversial, and it's very interesting that it made it onto the Hugos list, and I think mainly it made it onto the list because it caused such a controversy. When this story came out, it was titled, I Sexually Identify as an Attack Helicopter, and that is a transphobic internet meme. When it came out, a lot of people were sort of taken aback by it. There was a lot of backlash, a lot of people very angry about what the story was doing, and it led to a really bad outcome for the author, who was not out yet, but is a trans woman, and she took it very, very hard, and the story was taken down. She was hospitalized for suicidal ideation, and there was a big discussion in the kind of SFF fandom community about how do we handle things like these stories when some people are really hurt by them, but also maybe the author was trying to work through what they were going through or express themselves. So it's a very interesting discussion and very interesting what happened. The story itself, though, was okay. It was interesting conceptually. It was doing something neat, but the writing wasn't so much my style. It was kind of over the top. It was very kind of in your face and pulling on your emotions and dragging you through the experiences, and it was just not like a super pleasant reading experience. I also wasn't 100% sure about the way that sexuality was mixed in with the gender question, and I just felt like the story itself while doing something interesting, wasn't quite my style and was a little bit grim and violent and overly graphic and these sorts of things.
And I think kind of going on that line, basically, there's even a bit in the story about how it's like where the narrator says, "Am I too in your face? Well, I'm an attack helicopter." Okay, so it's kind of like, I think there is a part of that is intentional, and it is a part of telling the author's story. But it doesn't necessarily generalize to a lot of people, and that, I think, is an important aspect of conversation around this story. So as a conceptual take, as a, part of the conversation that we're having in SSF fandom, I think this is an important story and an important piece of work. But as a story taken in and of itself, in terms of how the theming is delivered and things like that, it is not as tight as I would like it, and it is not as crafted as I would like it. Next, at number 3, we have The Pill by Meg Elison. And while this is number 3 per Shannon's ranking, it is actually number 1 for my ranking. I actually had a really hard time between the one that she ranked as number 1 and this, as to which I wanted to put on top, but this does it for me. So the base premise is that a pill is invented that allows people to shed fat. And then it kind of follows through societal societal ramifications after that. And more than that, I'm not going to say about this plot, because this is a story to be experienced. It is stressful, and I tend to be a little pessimistic or cynical at times, and consistently this story wound up going down paths that were worse than the paths that I was dreading. And so basically it's a nightmare of a story that is very dark. Content warnings awash for fat phobia, for societal pressures, I should say, explicit descriptions of all sorts, loss of control, all sorts of things. Okay, the story is raw and utterly powerful and gripping, and that's all I'm going to say about it.
Yeah, so I think that this story was powerful. It was incredibly well written, but whoa, was it dark. So the reason why this ended up on 3 on my list is because I was so close to DNFing this story. It is just brutal. Such that it's like a nightmare. And it really is. It's so hard to read through, but it's doing something very, very meaningful. I think that this story is really, in the scariest way possible, talking about the way that society tries to impose itself on our bodies, and the way that people can be stuck where either you try to hate your body and conform to what society wants, or you love your body but become almost like a spectacle. And it is just such a dark story, but it is very, very well written, and it is really quite graphic, which is another reason why it wasn't as much my style. Next, at number 2 is Two Truths and a Lie by Sarah Pinsker. This is a story about a woman who goes back home to visit her family, and while she's there, she ends up helping out an old friend who is cleaning out his family home. And while she's there and looking at sort of all of these old things, she makes up a lie talking about an old creepy television show for kids, and it turns out that he remembers it. So it's somehow not a lie, even though she was making it up. And so this leads her down a little bit of an investigation, trying to understand, was this real, and what really happened, and why does she not have memories of it? So this story is very much in line with some other short stories we've read by Sarah Pinsker, in terms of it has excellent atmosphere. I love the writing, this sort of creepiness, a little bit of dread, this question, this mystery of what's really going on that is slowly unfolded over the course of the story. I was completely enthralled in this the entire time we were reading, and just so interested in seeing where it was going. I don't know that this necessarily has tons of layers of meaning, but I do like the way that it talks about lies and truth and memory and kind of examines some of those. And just for me, this was such an enjoyable, gripping read that it made my number 2.
And I think if you're looking for something to just lose yourself in, like a Twilight Zone episode kind of feel to it, this is an excellent story. It was thoroughly creepy and thoroughly enjoyable.
And number 1 is Burn, or The Episodic Life of Sam Wells as a Super by A.T. Greenblatt. This is a story about Sam Wells, who is a man who's trying to rebuild his life after he lost everything, all of his friends, family, job, when it came out that he has a superpower that he developed later in life of being on fire. And it came out kind of publicly. So he's trying to rebuild his life, and he decides that the only way he can do this, other than exiling himself, is to learn how to control the fire and to join up with a team of superheroes. Even though his power isn't very strong, they hire him because he's got a history in accounting, which is very useful. And so this whole story is about his journey into dealing with his powers and kind of finding found family in the other supers and dealing with the kind of discrimination in this world against people with superpowers. I loved this story so much. I felt so much for Sam Wells. I loved the world building. I loved the way it talked about the discrimination and the aggressions of everybody, about the choices, about him trying to understand his body and come to terms with it and accept himself. I just thought that this story was so well written. I loved the world building, and I loved the themes of it very, very much.
And the writing charm was just brilliant as well. And in a sense, it follows, it's a story of a person after an outing and basically trying to find their tribe. And it's deeply personal, and it's kind of like all the struggles he goes through, and it's so touching and moving. It's a beautiful story.
Yeah, I absolutely loved this. And A.T. Greenblatt is somebody whose short stories I've really loved in the past, and I was so looking forward to this one. This is one of the only ones that I actually read before the nominations were due. It's the only one that I nominated, but I loved it so much upon a second reread. It's just an excellent story, and it is available online for free, so that is linked below. I highly recommend it. Okay, so those are our rankings for the Hugo novelettes. If you guys have read any of these, if you have any thoughts, any ideas, any recommendations, anything at all, just leave us a comment down below.